My name is Vera Ankumase. After completing this session, you should be able to explain formal education and list at least 4 characteristics of it. Explain non-formal education and list at least 4 characteristics of it. Demonstrate an understanding of informal education and list at least 4 characteristics of it. And state the methods of informal education. Now let's look first at formal education. This form of education is deliberately instituted and takes place in a special designated place known as the school. It deviates from the traditional education, that is the informal education. This type of education was imported and have become part of our culture as at now. Formal education is a pen and push education, which is intentional and systematic, and it is based on the selection and systematic structuring of experiences. Formal education is basically paper and pen type of education, with little emphasis on vocational education, and not everybody can receive this form of education. It is based on your experience. Formal education carefully involves objectives, roles, and patterns of operations in line with accumulated knowledge and culture of the society. Now let's look first at formal education. This form of education is deliberately instituted and takes place in a special designated place known as the school. It deviates from the traditional education, that is the informal education. This type of education was imported and have become part of our culture as at now. Formal education is a pen and push education, which is intentional and systematic, and it is based on the selection and systematic structuring of experiences. Formal education is basically paper and pen type of education, with little emphasis on vocational education, and not everybody can receive this form of education. It is based on your experience. Formal education carefully involves objectives, roles, and patterns of operations in line with accumulated knowledge and culture of the society. There are 3 subsystems and components of formal education, that is organization, human, and curriculum. We will first look at organization, and under organization we have 2 subsystems. We have the mentor and the sponsor. The mentor here means formal educational institutions have a legally established framework with particular purposes, goals, and objectives. That is, the institutions have goals and purpose to achieve. Then the sponsor here are the politicians, the political, the religious, industrial, or other institutions which support and govern the formal institution, the formal educational institutions. We are looking at the bodies that provide scholarships, give funds to the schools for teaching and learning materials to support teaching and learning activities in the school. On the human, we have 2 subsystems. That's the mentor and the students. The mentors here are trained and certified personnel who teach, counsel, administer ideas, skills, and knowledge to the learners. For example, I am the mentor in this particular situation. Then the students are the participants who are to be educated, and these are you, the students I'm teaching now. Then we have curriculum. Under curriculum, we have two subsystems. That's the content and the media. The content refers to the body of knowledge, subject, or skill which students are expected to learn. For example, this course, that's Principles and Practice of Education, is an example of the content. Then media is the materials, equipment, plans, and process through which learning experience are provided to participants. So these are the teaching learning materials that support the teaching and learning process. Now let's look at the characteristics of formal education. Formal education takes place in a school. It is systematically structured and chronologically graded. If we say it's chronologically graded, if you take the University of Cape Coast, for example, we grade students from A to E. That's from the highest to the lowest. Then it is curriculum guided. It is teacher and student centered. It is age specific. And it is hierarchically structured and starts from the primary to the university level. So with a formal education, you cannot just start from JHS and end at the university. You will have to start from the primary school, that's the lower primary, which includes the kindergarten and all that, before you get to the university level. Now, let's look at the non-formal education. This form of education is any intentional and systematic education which occurs outside the normal or traditional school system. And this form of education is aimed at specific target group of people, such as the youth, the aged, expectant mothers, school dropouts, etc. Here, the non-formal education is not age-specific, and as it has already been said, it occurs outside the school. Although this form of education is somewhat structured like the formal education, sometimes curriculum guided and teacher-centered, it does not involve highly organized content, staff, and structure as the traditional school system. In other words, non-formal education is any intentional and systematic educational enterprise which occurs outside the traditional school system. It is different from incidental or traditional education in that non-formal education is intentional and systematic. We can have examples as remedial classes for WASSCE candidates, vocational and apprenticeship training for the youth, extension services for farmers, adult literacy programs, health education for nursing mothers, etc. and etc. Now let's look at the characteristics of non-formal education. Already we have looked at the characteristics of formal education. So with a non-formal education, it is need-centered. That is, if you take the farmers, for example, if they have to use weedicide in their farm, that is need, it's something that they need. So it's need-centered. So if they have the education will be based basically on that need. That's why it's need-centered. It is less costly than the formal education. It takes place at any learning site. It can take place in the farm, it can take place at the school, it can take place at the marketplace, any place that is suitable for that particular need. Non-formal education can take place. It is not likely to be identified as education. It does not involve customary admission criteria, and it is aimed at specific target group. For instance, if students want to do remedial classes, the education is aimed at that group that wants to do the remedial classes. It occurs at a more flexible setting, and it does not involve highly organized content. It is very flexible. It usually occurs outside the school. Yes, now we are looking at informal education, and this is the traditional, incidental, or indigenous education which is acquired consciously or unconsciously. Learning occurs everywhere, including the home, the school, the community, the workplace, the bush, sea, any place. Learning occurs at any place, anywhere. Learning is not organized or structured, and the main agencies are the home, the peer group, the community, the religious organizations, etc. We hope that throughout your life there are some experiences you have learned without being taught. These experiences are best gained through informal means. Most of the experiences that we gain can be from our peers, others from our communities. We learn from everything that goes on in the community, either consciously or unconsciously. Now let's look at some characteristics of informal education. Like we have already said, it occurs consciously or unconsciously. Consciously, you'll be taught what to do. For example, if you are a girl in the house and you want to prepare soup, you look at how your mother go about preparing the soup. So you will try it. So consciously, you follow the steps of your mother. And there are some that you do unconsciously. Learning is not organized and structured. As compared to the formal education, where learning is structured, you have time for each subject. You have time for play. With the informal education, learning is not organized. It can happen at any time, anywhere, at any place. It is not structured. Learning can occur everywhere, and the agencies of learning in the informal sector are the home, the peer group, the community, the religious bodies, and etc. It can take place within the formal setting, but that does not mean it is a formal education. Now, methods for traditional education. That's still on the informal education. It can be traditional education. You can either say traditional education or informal education. And the methods used in traditional education is observation, imitation, identification, and participation. For example, if your father is a carpenter and you want to be a carpenter, you first have to know whether you want to be a carpenter. That is the identification. You have to know whether you want to be a carpenter. So if you want to be a carpenter, then it means that you observe your father doing his carpentry work. When he wants to make a chair, you'll be there to see how he goes about, how he starts and finishes with the making of a chair. Then at a point in time, you start imitating what your father did. Then after imitating, you become perfect and you participate in doing the chairs. So the methods for traditional education, that's methods that are used for the training in traditional education. You have observation, you have imitation, you have identification, and participation. You will identify, observe, imitate, and participate. This brings us to the end of Unit 1, Session 1. Unit 1, Session 2. Unit 1, Session 2. Thank you.